Hi, everyone. Welcome to MECCA Moments for this Friday, May 1st. We are already in May. Joining me is Dr. Mercedes Ebanks and Miss Monica Samuel. Today, we're talking about grief during the pandemic. How are you ladies doing today?
Well,
Doing well.
well, thank you.
That's awesome. Okay, so Dr. Ebanks, can you introduce our guest for today?
Yes, I would like to welcome Monica Samuel again to the Mecca Moment. The last time she was here, she spoke about being single during the pandemic. But just to give you a little bit of information again about Monica, um, Monica Samuel has been a therapist with the MECCA Group for approximately 5 years now, and she has served in numerous capacity, working in the schools, doing evaluation, providing therapy with children, as well as working with our private clients on a variety of different topics. Monica received her Master's of Science in Clinical Psychology from Howard University. Welcome, Monica.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So, I guess we all went to Howard. Is that for one of our degrees at least?
Yes, HU.
HU. All right, Monica. So let's get started. We've been talking about grief and coping in various ways over the past few weeks. Can you tell us what people are experiencing out there right now during this time?
Yeah, I think that grief is a universal thing that we all experience, right? But at this time during COVID-19, I think it has become a lot more complicated in many ways for folks out there to grieve in a way that is typical to what we're used to doing, or what the rituals that we typically engage in when someone dies. And given COVID-19, given this pandemic, and given the unexpected nature of many of the losses that we're experiencing, it has been overwhelming for many of us, many of us. And so even the anticipatory grief of being fearful of of losing someone during this time, and then not knowing how to grieve them because because of social distancing, we are not able to engage in funerals in the way that we would typically engage. The funerals are small, or they're not happening even. Um, in ter- in providing space for the community to come together around the person who has lost someone, and who is grieving. You come over, and you bring food, and you sit, and you just provide that space for that person to share their memories and to grieve. We're not able to do that right now. And so it's a very difficult time for many of us within this time period.
So let's talk about that. We're in this state of hypervigilance, and a lot of people are just on edge, and they don't know when, how, even just normal loss, outside of having someone die of coronavirus. But you just don't know how you may lose someone during this time, and you got the impact of not being able to be with them dying alone or suffering in sickness alone. How does this grief look different from grief in our old normal?
Absolutely, absolutely. So just like you said, the inability to even, people talk about the inability to even go to the hospital with their loved ones, to be at bedside, to understand what's going on in terms of the doctors, and the health professionals in the hospitals sharing information. All of that makes it even more complicated if our loved one transitions and passes. How do we then cope? Because typically there's a time period where we're able to say our last goodbyes. We're able to hold a hand and hug, and all be around that person as they transition. But now we're not able to do that, and that makes things so much more complicated, for on so many different levels. And then not knowing if perhaps there's a spouse, and that spouse is also not doing well, and so can't be there for that loved one So many things in the unexpectedness, as you talked about, the unexpectedness of like, okay, well, what's going to happen next? Because every day we are bombarded with, who's contracted the illness, today, and have there been additional deaths in our community? And even if we're not directly impacted by deaths within this pandemic, it's still affecting especially Black and Brown communities in a
Right.
proportionate manner. And so there is a sense of collective loss even. And most often we just don't know what to do with this. We don't know what to do. And so we have to talk. And so I appreciate your having me on to talk about this.
Uh, yeah, glad to have you here. Let's talk more about complicated versus normal grief. Can you
Mhm.
expound up on that?
Yeah, definitely. So typically, many of us have heard about or learned in school the stages of grief, and oftentimes we think about the 5 stages of grief. If you're familiar with the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. And so, in that model, there is this thought that we go through these stages of grief to come out on the end of having some level of acceptance that this has happened, we've lost our loved one, and it is time to move on. Um, However, that model, though it allows for some recycling through those stages, is not always the most appropriate model, and is not the most modern model. And there's a model that I oftentimes use in my work, Warden's 4 tasks of mourning. And in this model, um, there's not a sense of stages of grief and then coming kind of out on the other side and being okay, but more of a process or a task of what do we do with these feelings? What do we do with this loss? And so the way that that model describes the process of mourning, the journey of mourning, is accepting the reality of the loss. So the intellectual, just, okay, this has happened. This person has been lost. This person has transitioned. And then getting to the point of being able to work through our grief, work through our pain, work through the loss. And what exactly does that look like? Again, grief is a universal process and a journey, but it's very individual. And so, culturally speaking, even we have different rituals that we engage in. And then individually, we have different ways of grieving. And so, working through that pain and that grief, which may be complicated in that nature. There may be shame or guilt or resentment, even in how we grieve or how we feel surrounding our grieving process. And so that leads to some complications. Um, and then in terms of Warden's task of mourning, the third task would be to adjust. The point would be to adjust to the environment in which our loved one is no longer there, and what that looks like, and to build a new reality for ourselves, not negating the impact that that person has had on our lives, but adjusting to that new reality. And then in the end, finding that enduring connection with that person who has transitioned and what that looks like. And again, it's a process and it's a journey, and it's not one step necessarily after another. And it's also not, there's no time limit on this process that we go through in terms of grieving.
I love that you mentioned that it's really kind of not linear and
Exactly.
it's a cycle. And so at any point you can experience any of those stages of
Absolutely.
grief. And when we talk about grief and mourning, grief is, the experience of loss, and mourning is how we display that. And you talked about rituals.
Mhm.
With the pandemic, those rituals are being interrupted. How are you seeing
Absolutely.
people mourn now? And with this new experience, is it harder to mourn? Are
Yeah.
we using technology now to mourn um, publicly? What are you seeing with mourning now during this pandemic?
Absolutely. It's incredibly challenging. And I think that as a society, we need to recognize that it is, in fact, quite challenging right now. And so we need to be mindful of the fact that the, no, the normalcy that would typically surround such a tragic event or difficult event doesn't always have to be a tragedy. But in cases of people being lost to COVID-19, a tragic event, it does look very different. And so we have to, as a society, acknowledge that this time is more challenging. Because if we don't acknowledge that it is more challenging, we may be more likely to be critical of ourselves and critical with how we're dealing with it. Um, Thinking about an example that I recently heard of or was recently privy to, a loved one passed away, and instead of being able to um, engage in the typical burial process, this loved one had to be cremated because of the circumstances surrounding the death and with everything that's going on. And so the loss of that ability to mourn in the way of having a funeral and going to the gravesite and so forth is very challenging. And so we have to recognize that there's an additional stress that those of us who have lost people are going through, and be kind to ourselves and be kind to those people who are going through it.
And so, how do you celebrate a life that has someone that you love that has passed away in this time?
Mhm.
How do you come up with these rituals or create new ways? I know you just said cremation, and that really
Mhm.
probably wasn't part of the plan.
Yeah.
But how do you reconcile um, the need for change in terms of mourning and rituals during this time?
Yeah, I think that with death and the mourning and the rituals surrounding, it's all very cultural and again very individual, and so we do have to be very we do have to discuss. I think that's going to look different for each person, honestly,
Right.
and I think that adjusting and being flexible in the way that we're thinking about how we celebrate our loved one, how we celebrate their life, how we grieve. That we're going to have to be extremely creative with that. I noticed that loved ones are doing parades, car parades by the homes of people who've lost their loved ones, just showing their support and showing that they're loved and they're not alone. Because essentially, that's what grief is, or part of grief is feeling um, alone in many ways, feeling like something that is steady in your life, or something that is a standard in your life is gone. And so helping our loved ones or helping your friends or whoever understand that they're not alone, um, by engaging in these drop bys with food, sending things to the house, going by and getting together and going by the house and just saying, hey, we're here and we love you, and we know that you are grieving, and even in this time of social distancing, you're not by yourself.
And you mentioned cultural kind of rituals and
Mhm.
cultural
Yeah.
things that happen, and sometimes cremation may not be an option no matter what because of religious beliefs or cultural beliefs.
Mhm.
And so, kind of coming up with a plan, um, you know, how do you work through that if there's no option for burial, if there's no option for a funeral and religious rites? How do
Mhm.
you work through that? And yeah, how do you just work with that? And it's challenging to think about.
It is, and I don't think there's necessarily a correct answer or a
Right.
playbook to how to do this. I think that part of it is that, like I mentioned earlier, I think that those of us left behind who are challenged with having to perhaps not have the memorial that you expected to have, or the burial that you expected to have, the funeral you expected to have. Um, oftentimes those left behind can be left with a sense of guilt of not being able to provide that for their loved one. And so working through the fact that it's not the fault of anyone, honestly, and having to make some really hard decisions. And so I don't think that there's necessarily a correct answer to how everyone is kind of working through how to grieve, how to mourn, how to honor their loved one. It's a very challenging thing, and so I know some people are just making plans, which can be comforting in and of itself, but making plans to have memorials once they're able to, and what that's going to look like. And so knowing that this will be over eventually, and so being able to say, there will be a memorial, there will be a way to honor my family member, my loved one, is really important.
So, what are signs that we should be looking for if we're experiencing ourselves, or we're noticing? We can notice that in our family members who are at home quarantining with us. What are some characteristics and signs and traits of grief that we should look for?
Right. So oftentimes, again, I said a little bit earlier, we think about grief being, even HR tells us, right?
Right.
You got 5 days to grieve. That you've got 5 days, or you've got whatever, depending on the relationship you had with the person who's passed away. And so I think our society tells us that there are a certain amount of days that we're supposed to grieve, or weeks that we're supposed to grieve, and it doesn't always look like that. And so after all of the business of funeralizing a person and that happens, weeks later, we can still be grieving and not recognize it. And so your question is right on time, and that an inability to concentrate may be a sign of grieving. Sleeping more than usual, overindulging in food and drink and online shopping be a sign of grief, and that you're still grieving. Being angry, honestly, being angry or being irritable also be a sign of grief. Physical symptoms, we strongly believe in the mind-body connection. And so when we're not feeling good, our body typically tells us. And so we're having physical malaise that can't be otherwise determined by or otherwise accounted for by a physical ailment, stomach ache and headaches and those kinds of things just constantly. That may be a sign that we're still grieving, having low energy, or just feeling fatigued quite a bit. All of those may be signs that we're still grieving, or that we're grieving and still grieving, and acknowledging that, because grief is normal. It's a normal process. It's a part of life, right? It's a part of what we have every right to do. And so sometimes we are in this frame of mind that there's a time limit on how long I should grieve.
Right.
And then all these other kinds of symptoms can pop up and get in the way of our functioning when we don't allow ourselves the time that we may need.
Let's bring in Dr. Ebanks. When we thinking about grief in children, how do these signs, and Monica, you can jump in too, do we see the same kind of symptoms in children when they're grieving? And how do we recognize and kind of express that, even if they don't have words to communicate that they're experiencing this?
Yeah, and it's definitely children show the same signs that Monica spoke about regarding the overindulgence, wanting to sleep, not wanting to talk, staying up rather late, not saying that they're not sleepy or, tired. Also, they may not be doing some of the other things like, overindulgence in online shopping, but they could be playing video games for extensive period of time, almost like wanting to zone out. The irritability is certainly a sign, being angry wanting to be distanced and left alone for long periods of time, not wanting to eat, or eating excessively. Those are clear, could be clear signs that the child is grieving. And a lot of time, the children are reacting from what they see their parents are doing. So if the parent is trying to hold it all in and not express themselves and not talk, the child knows that there's something wrong and they're kind of being left in the dark. And it's better to speak to them, again, on a age appropriate language, and letting them know that you're sad, that, someone's ill, or, we lost a loved one, but sharing that feeling with them and helping them to find a way to celebrate that life. Maybe it is in writing a letter or a poem or drawing a picture or showing some way to express their grief. It could be in art, doing finger painting and, letting it out some way physically, instead of that physical being built in. And the children also can feel that anxiety of the fear of losing someone. Maybe they haven't lost someone. As Monica spoke earlier, it's not only the loss of someone, but the anxiety of the fear of losing someone.
I think that's absolutely the fear, the anticipation of something happening, the whole hypervigilance, right, Monica? And children can feed off of the energy that parents are, expressing around the home. And so how do we help parents kind of monitor that kind of expression?
Monica, you go first.
Dr. Ebanks?
So I would say that the parents to recognize first and acknowledge their feelings is first and foremost. If they have a family member, a loved one, a supportive friend that they could speak to, or also seek outside services to help them get through it, and to let the children know that they are getting help to get through this moment. Because again, not being able to go to the hospital, not being able to say their last goodbyes is traumatic, on its own. And it could certainly have feelings of guilt, of not being able to, tell their loved one, how much they will miss doing something, or wanting to share a last moment or share a last memory with them. So it is important that parents first recognize how they're feeling, and and be honest with themselves, and then being honest with their children.
So we have a question from Carl. He says, when you see the signs, what can you do?
Good, thank you. So when you see the signs of grief, what can you do?
Yes.
So I think that really speaks to, how do friends of those who have been lost, or family members perhaps of those who have been lost, comfort one another, and given that we're unable to do some of the ritualized or traditional things, what do we do? And so, calling, when you can, or video chatting when you can, and being very intentional about those kinds of behaviors, being very intentional about keeping in touch with the person who has lost someone. It's oftentimes after, like I was talking about, the business of someone passing away is done, then we can all go on with our lives. And with so much going on right now with COVID-19, it can be very easy to do that. But scheduling time to check up through video chat, if possible, or telephone calls, checking on your friends, checking on your loved ones. If you can, preparing a meal and leaving it at a safely at their doorstep. And so you are still able to show that you're caring and you want to provide for them. Um, the other thing I think has a lot to do with going back to how individually we process grief. And so oftentimes I think we try to figure out the perfect thing to say to someone when they
Mhm.
lost someone. We want to say, we want to express our condolences and we don't always know what to say. And so sometimes we say things that could invalidate their feelings.
Mhm.
Don't cry. Well, it's better, this way, or maybe something that's more religious based that can be comforting, but may not necessarily be comforting to that person at that time. And so I invite everyone to really save space to listen to what
Mhm.
that person needs at that time. Just providing a space to listen, providing a space to just be there. It could be just sitting on the
Mhm.
phone with
Mhm.
someone,
Mhm.
or just letting them know that you're there, and that there's not necessarily a perfect thing to say or do at this time. If that answers the question. I don't know if the question was more geared toward what do you do if you're experiencing those
Mhm.
signs, though. Yeah.
Yeah, I would certainly like to add to what Monica was stating is in terms of being a supportive friend during this time, may be not asking, well, how's she doing or how is he doing or, how are you doing, but just providing a scripture, via text or providing a quote, and letting them know that you're thinking about them and that you're there for them. But because they may be bombarded with the phone calls from the hospital or being bombarded from phone calls from other family members, that you have to respect their space, but letting them know that you are there for them and you're thinking about them and you're keeping them in prayer. And I think that's very important. It's just, providing that, for them, and it could be a photo, of a memory you have with them.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So when you say how helpful is therapy in contacting like the MECCA Group or some other organization for dealing with grief, how helpful is therapy during the grieving process?
Right, right. So I think that, oftentimes that is, well, what's the point of talking about something that's sad? Like it's sad, and just talking about something that's sad, is not necessarily helpful. Um, However, oftentimes we don't have a space to talk about our grief. We don't have a space to grieve without interjection of other other people's ideas or perhaps their own grief. And so therapy can absolutely be very helpful in just providing a safe space to grieve. If that grief is more complicated, so as I mentioned earlier, if there's shame because they weren't there in the way that they would have, society perhaps says that they should have been there, or they weren't there because of some other things that might have gotten in the way of them being there for that person when they pass. If there's some shame or guilty kinds of feelings. If that person was not necessarily um, a person who was a positive influence in our lives, or in that person's life, but society says that, well, you should be grieving.
Mhm.
It's a mother or a father, but that person really wasn't there, or perhaps was even abusive. And so then that grief becomes complicated because society says, well, that's your mom, that's your dad, that's your and so that person is passed now, you must grieve. However, the relationship with you was complicated. So in that instance, therapy can be very useful in helping people work through those kinds of complications surrounding grief as well. In addition, sometimes we can get stuck in one of those cycles that we talked about,
Mhm.
and we're overwhelmed with the feelings. We're overwhelmed with whatever is going on, and it's difficult for us to maintain our daily functioning. And so in that instance, as a therapist, I would want to understand not only providing that safe space, but understand the thoughts surrounding grief and the person that they are grieving. What are the thoughts? What is their view on how things should be happening, and their view on their connection with this person who is lost. And then, also when people have had a significant history of depression or trauma, or in this period of time during this pandemic, multiple losses. My family is in Detroit, and so there are people who have experienced loss one after another. When it becomes that complicated, that complex, that triggering on an almost daily basis, the cumulative effects of grieving can become very overwhelming. And so that may also be a time when connecting with a mental health professional to help work through the grief may be very, very important. So grief can be absolutely, therapy can be absolutely important during those times. And it doesn't always have to be one-on-one. It could be a group. There are groups that are dedicated to all kinds of losses.
Mm-hmm.
Who have lost, children, people who have had miscarriages, people who have lost a parent, different iterations. So there are groups that people can also be involved in that may also be helpful. So therapy may very well be helpful.
Dr. Ebanks, why is therapy important?
Therapy is very important to provide that safe space to be able to speak to someone and communicate with someone your rawest feelings and your rawest thoughts without fear of judgment or feelings of someone being biased against you and I think that's what's important. One of the unfortunate factors is just having to talk about suicide. We are, aware of on the news how there was an ER physician in New York, Dr. Brain, I believe her name was, and she committed suicide. She had COVID. She was able to recover from COVID-19, continue to work on the front line in the hospital, and it appears as that entire experience overcame her. And I know that her family was, from what I've, read and seen, was very supportive and, just needing to have additional services for her. This situation that we're all undergoing is a crisis that is touching everyone. And not everyone has the same resources, financial resources or accessibility to resources. We know that. However, there is a need to talk about that and be able to provide information, whether it's through community agencies or hospital settings or private practices, to talk about mental health. And that's really why we even started the Facebook Live segments on the MECCA Group, was to just bring awareness to mental health, especially during this pandemic, bring a need to talk about emotional wellness and being at peace and comfort even during these trying times, and to provide support, because we could probably all state that we have personally been affected by this some way, somehow, whether it's a financial, it's a family member perhaps, or a friend of a friend, someone that we may all know has had some experience directly with COVID-19. And everyone deals with things differently, as we've talked about today. So everyone is experiencing grief differently. Everyone is is coping with it differently. And what therapy again provides is a safe space, to talk about that. So
I like that you mentioned that everyone has been dealing with some experience with during this pandemic, whether it's financial, whether it's job loss, whether it's a family member or a friend. And I guess that's a great way to talk about types of grief that don't have anything to do with death. What are Can you experience grief from losing a job or losing activities outside, or is it possible to experience grief outside of just what we typically think death?
Well, absolutely. Dr. Ebanks?
no, I was gonna say, and in one of our earlier segments, Dr. Mack mentioned for children, and young adults who are not being able to have that experience of their prom that they look forward to, or that graduation, being able to walk across the stage. They might have been the first member of their family to be able to walk across the high school stage or or their college. That's a loss, because it's almost like that buildup of anticipation. You work so hard for, and then it's not being able to celebrate that, And I know, for example, I've heard of so many events that are trying to remedy that, and I applaud those organizations. I know LeBron James is doing an event, I think it's called Graduating Together, for high school students. Oprah Winfrey through Facebook is doing one for college graduation, and that is excellent. And I know family members are doing, events on their own, whether it's virtual, and it's important to still celebrate those victories, celebrate life. And even as we spoke to Monica earlier about, mourning how to celebrate life of a loss of a loved one that we've lost, being able to do a home, going some way by saying it's going to be at a later date or a time, or again, being able to do a Zoom where everyone could share their favorite memories of that loved one, or putting together a virtual photo collage of memories of that loved one and sharing that with others. Those are ways to still celebrate life.
Absolutely. And just to add on to that, as Dr. Ebanks talked about, absolutely, in terms of loss, those lost moments trigger a grief response. So the effects of grief that you find from losing a loved one, and what happens to, in terms of concentration and so forth, the things that I spoke about earlier, can absolutely happen with the loss of those moments, loss of graduation, loss of family reunion that you look forward to every year, loss of other significant events, loss of the time to be able to spend with older relatives and loved ones who are in nursing homes, who, that's shut down. And so that's a loss of having those connections, those human connections with our loved ones. That's absolutely a loss of a job, loss of relationships. All of those things absolutely trigger the grief response. And so you may see the very same kinds of manifestations in your life.
So let's look at how we can deal with that. What can we do? How can we cope with the extraordinary amount of loss that many people are experiencing, whether it's, job loss, family loss, friend loss, human loss? How can we cope and deal with our grief?
The first thing is acknowledging that this is happening and that this is overwhelming, and that extra support and extra assistance and just extra is needed at this time, because oftentimes we don't want to talk about things that are unpleasant. So if we don't talk about it, if we don't cry, if we don't yell, if we don't scream, it's okay. But no, we need to acknowledge that this is hard. All of this is hard, and talk with one another about, how to manage during these times. Sharing that in and of itself is therapeutic, because it takes away the feeling of loneliness and isolation. It takes away the feeling of, well, I should be doing better because, there's some people who don't have a home, or there's some people who don't have anything to eat, or there is enough compassion for the loss of graduation as there is the loss of a loved one. There's enough compassion in this world, I believe, to not minimize necessarily your personal loss, and so acknowledging that this is so difficult. And then self-care. And what does that look like? Everyone says self-care. What does that look like? But self-care is so very important, at any time, but definitely during this time. And so that may look like, um, engaging in more rituals at home that are just about feeling good. It's not cleaning, it's not doing anything quote unquote productive. It's about taking care of yourself. And what does that look like? If it's, taking those extra long baths, doing those facials, doing those manicures, doing, those things that make you personally feel good. And so everyone has things that they oftentimes do, and they feel like, oh, I shouldn't be doing this because I should be taking care of my kids right now, or I should be doing this other thing. But self-care is so very important right now. And then understanding that it's not normal. And so taking away that this time is not normal. So taking away this feeling of, I need to maintain in a normal manner. I need to be productive like I usually am. I need to taking those pressures away from yourself when you need to. I think is really, really important. This isn't a normal time, so I think that's really, really important. Giving ourselves time to grieve, maybe longer than we would typically expect. Reaching out to family and friends on a regular basis. It's a time, oftentimes, when we've lost someone, it can be easy to isolate during this time or to withdraw. And so reaching out, to family members and to friends is really important. And I think also alternating activities. We talk about that in grief work a lot. Alternating activities. So there are times where we have to take care of the things surrounding the loss. So whether or not it's just the business of, attending to the transition of your loved one, or even, gathering things together for a memorial, or gathering things together for, what Dr. Ebanks was talking about, in terms of the Zoom, there's that. And then also alternating that with activities that are totally unrelated, that are just about us, that are about our hobbies, or that are about things that make us feel good. Because those are the things that are restorative, and those are the things that help us improve our ability to be resilient during this time. And resiliency is such an important, piece that we have to build during this time.
Absolutely. I think resiliency is the cornerstone of moving forward. And
Yeah.
Once you're down, you have to get back up. I think we don't honor the acknowledgement as much as we should. Just acknowledging can lift a huge weight off of your life, and just being present and saying, this is not right. I am not feeling good. And having to move away from that denial. So I love that you mentioned that. Dr. Ebanks, can you tell us about therapy services?
Yes, certainly. And to again, thank you to Monica Samuel and to yourself, Brandon, for participating in this very important conversation. We've had a number of comments related to this. A pastor asked about how to help his members grieve loss of a loved one. So this is a very touching topic that is really affecting so many. So once again, the MECCA Group is here to provide resources as well as services. We may not be the best fit, but we're going to help you to find the best fit, and we will, again, even with the follow-up with this, we will post some resources online on our page of other contacts that individuals may want to reach out or pass along to someone that you know that is grieving the loss of a loved one. So you can contact the MECCA Group at 202-529-3117 or visit our website, themeccagroup.llc.com.
Well, thank you so much, ladies, for offering your expertise and giving us some coping strategies, and helping us all move through this difficult time. But it doesn't always have to be difficult. There is relief out there. There's support, and thank you for sharing those resources, and thank you for giving us a little hope on this first Friday of May.
Yes.
How did we get here? Like, I literally have to look at a calendar every day just to know where we are, because of course we're at home. But how did we get here? We're here, but it doesn't have to be terrible. Thank you so much, ladies. I guess we'll see you back next week, Dr.
Yes. Oh, yes. And next week we have another guest speaker, a MECCA therapist as well, Dr. Laura Rubacava. She will be speaking about Latinos and how they are managing stress during the pandemic.
Bueno, nos vemos.
25 de mayo.
Claro.
So.
So you have a lot of great people.
Yes, we have a great team at MECCA. We have a great team at MECCA. So
yes. Okay. Have a great weekend, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.